Good morning. Thank you for joining me. It's a long-standing habit of mine each month to read a different book of the Bible. Invariably, I find something new to sit with. This month, I'm in the Gospel of Matthew, and a couple of days ago, I was stopped by chapter 28, verse 8. The women come to the tomb near dawn to perform the proscribed service Jesus' lifeless body would require. And suddenly, they are engulfed in a staggering revelation. Emotionally, they get singed by the lightning strike of the resurrection. And verse 8 says, "And they ran from the tomb with fear and great joy." Fear and great joy. We can certainly understand the great joy. Their beloved friend is not dead. The love of the Father has resurrected the Son. Of course, great joy. But fear? Fear of what? And fear and great joy, both in the same instant? Then I recalled some similar expressions in other scripture. For example, in Luke chapter 5, some men bring their paralyzed friend to Jesus. They have to cut a hole in the roof to get their friend and Jesus in the same room. Jesus forgives the man's sins, and then he says, "Stand up and walk." And the man does that. And Luke says, "And a great fear seized the crowd." And remember that wonderful story of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, awakened in the boat to calm the disciples? He also calms the storm. And the response of the disciples? They were filled with fear, saying one to another, "Who is this?" And after Pentecost, given the remarkable numerical growth of the church, the people were led to a deeper piety and commitment and to a remarkable willingness to share all things in common. So remarkable was that it says in Acts chapter 2, "And a deep fear fell upon them all." So, in the wake of these scriptures, and you and I could probably name others, we ask ourselves, what's happening here? In these stories, people are experiencing an inward disturbance, far deeper, far more profound than the typical glad, mad, sad feelings that we're used to. These stories record the resultant state of mind and emotion when what is encountered has a quality so extraordinary as to defy intellectual grasp. It appears that when God breaks in, and when we are consciously aware of God's presence, we experience mystery. We experience wonder. We experience the shiver of awe. I think this may have been what happened to Isaiah. He talks about it in the 6th chapter of his book. King Uzziah has died. Now, given everything, King Uzziah was a good king. And I think maybe Isaiah is grieving. And I think he's worried. He might be anxious for the political future of his people. And so he just goes about doing what he knows to do. He just tries to do his job. And suddenly, that great empty space of the temple, and maybe that empty space in his anxious heart, are filled with flying angels and loud singing and the thundering voice of the Almighty One. and Isaiah is shaken to his very foundations. Fear and great joy, mystery, wonder, and awe. And I ask myself, how long? How long was it, do you think, that those seraphs had swooped and darted and called out and pierced the smoky presence of the Almighty before Isaiah noticed it? Here's the reason I'm asking myself that. If God is with us, as God has promised us, as God has said, if God is in fact with us, why is it, do you think, that we so rarely encounter wonder and mystery and awe? If, as the seraphs sang, soaring, echoing beneath the temple ceiling, the whole earth is filled with the glory of God, if that is so, why do we so rarely experience it? That we can and do miss the holy presence of our God is well known, and not just among church folks. In the Broadway musical Flower Drum Song, a principal character sings, 100 million miracles are happening every day. And those who say they disagree are those who do not hear or see. And remember that insight from poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote, "The earth is crammed with heaven, and every bush is aflame with the glory of God. But only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries." I will confess to you that sometimes I wonder, historically, what might have happened to us all if Moses had been so lulled by counting sheep that he had sleepwalked right past that fiery presence out there in the desert. Well, so today is June 25, and on this date in history, at least two things occurred that I believe are helpful on this topic. First, on June 25 in 1876, George Armstrong Custer and 5 companies of soldiers were killed by the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho at the Battle of Little Bighorn River. That might have been predictable. Custer was last in his graduating class at West Point, and he amassed what was such an abysmal conduct record that it was among the top 5 worst conduct records in the history of the school. With such a horrible record there, when he graduated, likely he would have been given some dead-end post, were it not for the Civil War and the desperate need for officers. Now, by all accounts, Custer was an arrogant peacock, showy and gaudy. He had his own uniforms tailor-made for him and loaded with glitz because he was the consummate self-promoter, publicity-seeking officer, which made him reckless. At Gettysburg, he lost the highest number of soldiers of any Union cavalry brigade in the entire Civil War. About the only thing we remember him for is the Little Bighorn, and the only quotation that we recall him for that I know of comes from Little Bighorn, from one of the Crow scouts that served the army who recalls Custer commanding his troops, "Come on, boys, we got 'em. Let's finish 'em off and home for supper." The second event on June 25 was in 1947. And on today's date in 47, the world got its first look at the diary of Anne Frank. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, successful Jewish Franks, the Frank family, went into hiding. Anne Frank was 13 years old. 2.5 years later, she would be dead in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. But in the 2 years of her fright-filled concealment with her family, she kept a diary. And on today's date, in 1947, the world first heard the voice of that young teen, speaking of a godly reverence and a God-centered wonder from within a terrifying grip of suffering and fear. And here are a few quotations for which she is known. "The best remedy for those who are afraid or unhappy is to go outside somewhere to be quiet and alone with the heavens, with nature, and with God. I want my life to be useful, to bring enjoyment even to people I've never met, and that's why I am so grateful to God for having given me this gift of writing. I will keep to my ideals, because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Now, if I may say it, in our culture today, there seems to be a never-ending supply of George Custers, but fewer and fewer Anne Franks. And I want to be less like him and more like her. And so this morning, I want to ask for your help. I want to hear from you about this. Help me, if you can, with these questions. If, in fact, earth is crammed with heaven, is filled with the presence of our loving God, what do you do that causes you more fully to experience God's presence? Where do you find the wonder of the Eternal One in those everyday moments in your life? How are you keeping your soul tendered, yourself sensitized to the presence of our loving God all around you? I would be honored to hear from you concerning these things. Fear and great joy. When God's nearness, God's presence breaks in on us, and we are spiritually awake enough to recognize it for the precious gift that it is. If you're willing, I'd like very much to hear your experiences with fear and great joy, with the mystery and the wonder and the awe that you experience in the living presence of God. Okay. Well, bless your hearts today.